Let's finish up this discussion of optimal capital structure by getting into the final discussion in terms of looking at this graphically. So what I'm after in this part is to see these different ways of showing this theory, but then able to put words to it. And down below, you'll notice I actually have the components of a good answer talking about this whole issue, the pieces that should be there. I got a couple of approaches to that. So here's the formula we're looking at. The maximize the value of the firm, you need to maximize this formula. So remember, you maximize the value of the firm without any debt by simply maximizing the free cash flow from the assets that the firm owns. And those assets don't have to be assets that are actually on the balance sheet. They can be assets like brand identity, you know, their economies of scale, maybe they have, you know, anything that is an asset, whether it's on the balance sheet or not. Could be their employees and how well trained they are, their knowledge of the industry, their platform effect. There's several things. We might get into some of these later, depending on how much time we have at the end of the semester. Things like economic moats and Porter's five forces. There's a lot of things in finance that we use to try to figure out how can you increase the free cash flows of the firm. But then you want to bring in the capital structure, which is maximize the tax shield, but don't go so far that you start destroying the firm with financial distress costs. So, so if the tax shield is more than the cost of distress, you can keep going, add a little more debt. But once the cost of distress, the cost of potential bankruptcy starts overtaking the debt, you've gone too far and you need to stop. At some point, the cost of debt and the cost of equity are going to shoot up dramatically because people are worried about the firm's very existence. And at that point, you've gone too far and you may not be able to come back. So when people are worried about whether you're going to survive or not, your earnings going to become much more volatile. You're going to see distress at all levels, best employees leaving the firm, the bond market refusing to renew debt, all kinds of things going to happen. So any hint of a problem can definitely be a serious concern. And this varies by industry too. It really depends. Airlines tend to fare okay because they have tremendous assets they can use as collateral. Utilities fare very well because their earnings are protected by natural monopoly rules, and they tend to have very stable earnings. People tend to use about the same amount of utilities every year. So some industries it's clear. For some industries it's pretty rough, like technology companies. If a competitor comes in and takes over their business and they're disrupted, those firms are going to go out of business fast, whether it's a firm, I don't know, gosh, some of these tech companies like Yahoo, AOL that you've seen, I can't think of some of the others. There's just so many of them that have gone under. They can go under quickly because people just change their opinion about what the best technology is. And in those cases, they tend to have great earnings, very stable earnings, until a competitor comes in and takes them out. You could think of Blockbuster Video that Netflix put out of business. Those businesses will tend to have to use less debt, even if the theory says use more debt because you get the tax shield. They will tend to err far more on the lower debt side just because things can change so quickly. So the optimal level of financial leverage is the point of minimum cost of capital. So there is a trade-off in capital structure. Unfortunately, this is more theoretical than it is a true sit-down and do the calculation. But again, I talked about Dr. Damodaran in the last class. If you watch his video, he actually calculates it. He gets right to a precise point. My problem with his video is that he uses the times interest earned. And he says there's a relationship between that and credit ratings. And so you can tell when a firm gets too far that they're going to be downgraded quickly and that their cost of debt is going to soar and their distress costs are going to soar. I'm not quite sure. I believe that I have to see his numbers because time interest earned is not used that much in finance, not the way debt to EBITDA is used and those other ratios we use in Project 1. So since you can't really know what the optimal level is, most firms will be to the left of that level. But it is a good theory to provide a foundation for establishing corporate policy and capital structure policy. So I think firms probably think about it, they know it, they understand it. Do they actually sit down and calculate the exact that we need to have a debt to equity of 82%, 82.38% or something? No, I doubt there are many firms that do that. But again, if you're interested, watch the Demandaran video. He'll show you how he actually calculates that number for 2 firms. So how do we look at this graphically? All right, so let's start with my favorite one, the third one. I think I've got one other in there. Well, actually, I like this one too. So these last two, this blue one and this very last one, are very similar. They're almost the same one, and I actually like this one better. So let's look at this. So it's really important on the exam. What I'll do is I'll send you one of these graphs, and when you look at the graph, you'll need to have to figure out what they're looking at. So in this graph, they have cost of capital on the y-axis. This graph, they have cost of capital. So remember, the firm is optimal when cost of capital is the lowest. So lower on this y-axis is good. Lower on this y-axis is good. This graph, they don't have the cost of capital on the y-axis. They have the value of the firm. So higher is better. And same thing here, market value of the firm, higher is better. You notice they all have the same x-axis. It's how much debt the firm has. So the x-axis is how much debt ratio, debt to assets. Sometimes it's debt to equity, sometimes it's debt to assets. So let's look at this last one. So this last one is looking at debt to total capital. So it's debt, the debt plus equity. But essentially, as you move right, you're increasing your debt. And this is the cost of capital. So what are we looking for? So first of all, this is cost of capital. This is the WACC, so find the WACC. The WACC at its lowest point is where the firm is at its greatest value. That's the exact opposite of this graph, where here, as you increase debt, the value of the firm goes up. So the value of the firm is maxed right here. This is where cost of capital would be the lowest at this point. We're here to do the value of the firm. So if you have the value of the firm, if the graph is going up, then the y-axis is the value of the firm, the market value of the firm, and you want to be at the highest point. If the line is coming down, you're not looking at the value of the firm, you're looking at the cost of capital. So the firm is at its max value, where cost of capital is its lowest. What else do we notice? Well, cost of debt stays fairly stable as you increase debt. At some point, you increase debt so much that your cost of debt starts shooting up. You start getting downgraded, and you start losing people that are willing to loan to you. And your cost of capital goes up. It's real important to understand why cost of capital goes up. Cost of capital goes up because your debt is increasing. And remember, when you increase your debt, your beta goes up. And if beta goes up, cost of capital goes up. Now here's probably the most important part. You've got to get this into your answer. The cost of capital is declining. The reason cost of capital is declining is not because you're using more debt that's a lower cost. The only reason the cost of capital is coming down is because of the tax shield of debt. Because remember, the cost of debt stays the same, but it's cheaper. So as you add more debt, that's going to reduce your cost of capital. But at the same time, as you add more debt, it increases your cost of equity. So you're getting cheaper debt, but your cost of equity is going up. Without taxes, if there was no taxes in here, this cost of capital would be a straight line until you get the distress, and then it would shoot up. So it's very important to understand, this is real critical, must be in your answer. The only reason the cost of capital is declining is because of the tax shield of debt. That's the only reason. If there was no taxes in here, the cost of capital would just be a straight line, because putting more money in the low-costing debt is being exactly offset by the higher cost of equity. All right, so hope everybody understands that. And then at some point, the firm takes on too much debt, it becomes distressed, it can't borrow money, it gets restricted in what it can do, and the cost of capital shoots up. So the firm wants to be at this point. Most firms are to the left of this point, because if you get right to this point, if you miss it, you go a little too far over, it's hard psychologically to get markets and investors to get you back to the left. And plus, most firms like to be here just in case some new opportunity comes up. They say, well, sacrifice some of the value of the firm in order to have that option, that flexibility to do something with that debt if we ever need it. So that's how you explain this chart. Now, real careful, make sure you're listening. We'll talk about this when we get ready for the exam. I'll give you a chart like this, but I will not put any titles on anything. I won't say this is cost of equity. I won't say this is WACC. I won't say this is debt. I won't say what the axes are. So you have to label them. The highest line will always be cost of equity, and the lowest line will always be cost of debt in this graph. So remember the one where the line is coming down, your y-axis is cost of capital. So you know that that's cost of capital because we see a line coming down. And we know on all of the graphs, this is how much debt you have. I don't care if you say debt to equity or debt to capital. It doesn't really matter to me. You just want to say increasing debt. As you increase your debt, because it's theoretical, this is true whether it's debt or equity or debt to capital. And you have to label these, and then you want to lay this point, wherever cost of capital is the lowest, you want to label that as the theoretical optimal capital structure for the firm. That's where the firm's value is maximized. So cost of capital is the highest line. Weighted average cost of capital is in the middle. Cost of debt's in the bottom. The x-axis is always debt to capital. Cost of capital is on this graph if the middle line is declining. If you have a rising line like this one, then you're looking at the value of the firm. All right. If you look at this graph is almost exactly the same. You'll notice they have their debt rising a little bit faster than in this graph. In this graph, they have the cost of debt flat for quite a while and then shooting up. I think this graph a little bit overstates it, but it's probably a little bit more accurate. Here you see the cost of capital coming down. Again, you got to say that's only because the tax shield of debt. As you put in more debt, you get more tax shielded. This RE is what we've been talking about as KE. They use RE as the rate of equity instead of the cost of equity. RD, the rate of debt. And then this percentage cost is just your cost of capital. So, all right, so that chart makes some sense. Let's look at these other two. You can notice these other two charts are very, very similar. So again, the x-axis is how much debt they have. The VU is the value of the firm with no debt. So right here at zero debt, that's the value of the firm. As you increase debt, you get the value of the firm including debt. And you notice that the value of the firm goes up. This purple line is the value of that tax shield. So the tax shield is the only reason why the firm's value is going up. And then as you keep going up, it's that theoretical value of the debt, but it would keep going up because the debt tax savings is there, but at some point, the value of the firm is not going to keep rising because the bankruptcy cost is going to start to take over. And so where this purple line is its max, that's where the firm's value is max. That's optimal capital structure. I do not like this chart as much. I don't think it's as self-explanatory. So I'm more likely to give you ones like this, so make sure you know this. So let's look at the answer. I've got it two ways in here. Actually, I've got several in here that you can look at. Let's look at, boy, I don't know why I did it like this. It would have been better if I put these all together. But let's look at them and see how different there are. So first of all, the value of the firm is the value of its assets, the present value of the cash flow of the assets. So the value of the firm should not change as you move between debt and equity, assuming there's no taxes and no bankruptcy costs. That's the Miller-Modigliani theory. Capital structure does not matter to the value of the firm, but before tax, before bankruptcy. As the firm increases its debt, beta increases, so even though using cheaper debt, the savings is offset by the higher cost of equity. After tax, the value of the firm increases due entirely to the tax shield, interest expense, I should have said, I've been a more precise way of saying it. Interest expense is tax deductible, while dividends are not. So as you use debt, you're getting some of the cost of your debt is offset by the taxpayers, the other taxpayers. So the value of the firm increases as you add debt up to a point where bankruptcy cost starts taking over. The value of the firm is maximized where we balance the tax shield and bankruptcy costs, where WACC, such that, again, I got some typos in here, such that WACC is minimized. The value of the firm, that's an important concept to put in here. The value of the firm is maximized where WACC is minimized. WACC rate falls only because of the tax shield of debt. Other things that you could certainly put in your answer is our WACC formula. You know that. Here's the WACC formula without taxes. We know KD must be less than KE. So why does increasing the weight of debt not reduce WACC if KD is less than KE? As you put more weight on debt, ignoring taxes and bankruptcies, you add more debt. It makes KE go up because of the beta. So as you increase your weight to debt, beta rises, and so your KE rises. And they're two exactly, I could show you mathematically, but I don't think it's important for us. It's actually a mathematical truism, but it's important. It's not that important to us. So just let me know, just letting you know, as you increase WD, KE goes up by an amount such that this formula exactly stays the same. It doesn't change before tax. So the optimal value of the firm is where WACC is minimized before bankruptcy tax and taxes. WD, increasing WD decreases WE, but WACC is not impacted because KE rises. After tax, I don't know why I indented that, so I've got some issues here. After tax, increase in WD, WACC declines only because of the tax shield. At some point, bankruptcy rises. Therefore, the optimal is the minimum WACC. I think there's similar things in there. One of these days, I'll do a list where they're combined. So you should be able to somehow combine these. There's some overlap and there's some extra in there. One formula you might add in there is, remember KE. We've seen this several times, but it's the risk-free rate. Hopefully you've got this memorized by now. Plus beta times the market risk premium. And beta rises as you increase the weight in debt. So that's an important component. That could be your answer, and it's in there. I have it in my notes, but you might actually use, I don't have the actual formula that you can show that you increase that, beta goes up, and so your KE goes up, and so the increasing WD is offset by the increasing KE. All right, so that's that formula. Look at these graphs. I'll have a session where we can do some Q&A, especially as we get ready for the final. You can certainly write out your answer and talk about it, and I won't necessarily grade answers in advance. So it's, some of this is sit down and let your mind grasp these concepts. That's really, I really recommend now that you go back. Hopefully you've already read the Investopedia and the Wikipedia on optimal capital structure and Miller and Modigliani. Now I recommend you go back and do it again and see if they say it in a way that gives, a light bulb goes off as well. Most students struggle with this. It's not an easy concept. You've got to go over it a few times. I think it's not as hard as it seems the first time you see it. And I think mainly because there's just so many moving pieces. It's very logical and it's very well connected, interconnected. I think that's why Miller Modigliani was so well respected. It's a very comprehensive, integrated theory that just makes a lot of sense. It's very logical, but it does have a lot of moving parts. So you might create a mnemonic that has all the moving parts in it to make sure you address each one of them. So if you go back to that original list I started in the notes, that debt will cost less than equity, but if you need to decrease your debt, you increase beta, you increase your KE. Interest expense is tax deductible. Optimal capital structure is minimum WACC. That's the maximum firm value. That's a high level, but there's some more details that you want, and so this shows you the more details. So if you see a graph like this without anything marked, without any titles on it, you don't know what each line is, you should just be able to tell from the shape what it is. So if I actually do this again, optimal capital structure, and click on images, you can tell what kind of graph it is. Some of them are strange, not like that one, but here definitely that's cost of capital. That's the one we just actually did. So as you look at them, you'll see most of them are somewhat close. Here's another one that's very similar to what we did. I think that one almost looks exactly like that one. There are some of them I think are really bizarre. I just don't know how to explain them, that they're a little tough. This one obviously is cost of capital because you see the middle line. See how the middle line is declining? Here it's cost of capital. You can see the WACC declining and coming up. So most of them you can kind of tell what it is, but very famous theory in finance. So that's the cost of capital question. And So what we'll do is we have a little bit more to cover on this. The concept, I think you saw on Wikipedia they have the term pecking order. So the pecking order is, what do you use first? Debt, retained earnings, debt? Do you issue stock? What do you do? What's the pecking order? And that comes into this concept of signals. So we'll talk about signals and what that means for capital structure. And then we're almost through this topic, and then we'll do a PowerPoint presentation on business combinations. And we're right on schedule with the syllabus, so we're doing well. So this will be our last session for this particular class, and then we'll pick up with the Thursday class in the next videos.